Agronomist with the Western Winter Wheat Initiative. My topic today is disease management. I'm going to pay particular attention to fusarium and stripe rust because those have been the biggest issues with winter wheat for the last number of years on the prairies. The reason why we're concerned about fusarium, and I'm going to begin by talking about that, is that you can see by the slide here as compiled by Manitoba Ag, the levels of fusarium have been quite high in Manitoba last fall, 11.6% on average. There we go. On average, the fusarium has been 11.6% in the province last year, which is quite high. What this is if you look at the pricing provided by SIGI last fall, anything above 7% is pretty much almost impossible to deal with unless you're feeding it to ruminant animals. But what you'd like to do is keep your fusarium levels below 2%, so you'll see no discount at all. In most years, if you look at our historical data, you'll see that winter wheat, the fusarium levels in Manitoba have been below 2%. There's just the odd year that it seems to be excessively high. That was in 2014, of course. 2010 was quite high, and 2005 the levels were high. So it seems, well, once every 5 years we have to deal with high levels of fusarium. Don Cherry's not my favorite announcer. One of the things that he does that annoys me a little is his predictions, always pat himself on the back. That's not what I'm trying to do here. I'm just showing you a slide of my prediction from a webinar last year on why we should scout for fusarium, and because it was fairly predictable that we're going to have some issues and that we're going to be more susceptible to fusarium. So as I roll through my presentation, you'll see what conditions are more likely to cause fusarium and why it's easy to predict. Fusarium head blight, for those of you who have not had to deal with it, maybe out west, it's also known as scab and tombstone. If you look at the picture on the right, your first sign is usually some white spots on the blooms, and this is what you see in usually small cereal grains. It's caused by several species of fusarium, but fusarium graminearum is the primary one that we're concerned about. When you thresh the grain, you'll see a sample, and if you'll often see salmon-colored seeds. This is fusarium on the seed itself. The winter wheat that's infected has a toxin called DON, and it is fairly toxic to non-ruminant animals. And it also exhibits inferior baking quality, so there's only so much you can do with it once you have it. So when you talk about any disease at all, you need three things in the disease triangle for the disease to occur. You have to have the pathogen present, you need a susceptible host, and you need the proper environmental conditions for the pathogen. Once you have all three of those, you're going to have the disease. So I'm going to run through each of these three items as they relate to the disease of fusarium. When you look at the pathogen, how does it spread? It's generally blown from one cereal field. The spores are. They arise on the crop residue, and the spores will blow around. You can also, if you bale up the straw, you can transport the cereal that's been infected from one field in one area to another, and it can be seed-borne. So if you plant infected seed, it can get a hold that way. Generally, although all it will cause on that crop is a seedling blight. So a seed treatment is a very useful thing to do under those conditions. The actual cycle, as you can see, starting in the bottom left, if you have infected cereal residues, you can get spore production, particularly under warm, humid, wet conditions. And the key time for infection for winter wheat is during flowering. Just when the blooms open up there, the spores can infect the seed heads, and you'll get fusarium head blight symptoms that start developing. So I'm going to mention three things that you can do to minimize this disease. The big three, and then about four small things that add up to a big. The first, item is proper nutrition, and that was covered off in a previous talk. And keep your plants as healthy as you can; they're more likely to be able to resist the disease. Variety selection is the second big thing. You need a susceptible host for the disease to occur. If you look at the numbers generated by Manitoba Ag at their variety trials last year, they measured the average levels of fusarium and Dawn in each of the varieties, and you can see on the far left that Emerson is the only resistant variety at this point, and even under high infection rates that we saw in Manitoba, it had levels below 2%, which is excellent to see. The Macbeth trials aren't sprayed with a fungicide, so even under that kind of high pressure, Emerson had very low variety, very low fusarium occurrence in it. So that's awesome, and that's why it was seeded in a lot of fields in Manitoba. Unfortunately, Flourish had very high levels, and it was the variety that was replacing Falcon in Manitoba, so it was in a lot of fields, and you can see it seemed to be very susceptible to fusarium. I think that was partially caused by some poor agronomic practices that I'll discuss coming up in the next few slides. When it comes to the third peg of the disease triangle, environment, I often tell producers, don't bother to scout for infestation in Manitoba because if the conditions are right, it's going to be there. Fusarium needs high daytime temperatures and warm nights, and pretty high humidity levels too. So if you look back last year at the time period when most of the winter wheat was flowering, that's from June 23rd to about the end of June or into early July. I pulled this from Manitoba Ag, and you can see on the far left column, the temperatures were quite high during the day. The coldest they got at night was about 12 to 13, so we had fairly warm nights for the most part, and there was rain during that time period. The other thing I'll draw your attention to is on the far right-hand side is the rainfall as percent of normal up until that time. So you can see that most of these areas were above normal already for precipitation. So in a nutshell, we had high temperatures, we had high humidity, so chances are fusarium was going to be an issue in Manitoba last year. Luckily, you don't even have to go to that level. All you have to do is pull up these maps that Manitoba Ag provides, and I hear that they've provided in other provinces too. And just go into this when your producer's crop is starting to head and pull up these maps and see what kind of risks you have. And you can see at this time period last year when winter wheat was just starting to flower that the risk was very high to extreme drought agro Manitoba. And so basically, if you had a susceptible variety, which almost all the producers did, just go out there and spray was the answer. Carrying this through to the end of that June 30th time period, here's a map that you do not see very often. It's the whole area in Manitoba with extreme risk for head fusarium. So you know that you're going to have issues if you didn't spray your winter wheat. And unfortunately, in a lot of areas last year it was so wet that producers had a hard time getting into fields to spray. So I think that's another reason why levels were so high in Manitoba last year. So that's spraying is obviously something you have to look at. But the four smaller tips that I mentioned that add up to making a big difference to manage your fusarium all have to do with having a uniform crop. You can plan to have a uniform crop, and that is very important for winter wheat. I think more important than any other crop that I deal with in Manitoba. Winter wheat, there are huge benefits to having a uniform crop. The reason why I push for that so much is that when you have a uniform crop, you have more main stems, fewer tillers, and the less tillers that you do have, the easier it is to time your fungicide application for fusarium at heading. So let's step back and take a look at your seeding date. The optimum window is late August, early September. And what happened the previous year was that there was poor conditions for seeding, so that most of the winter wheat in Manitoba was seeded late. And that delays your maturity. And when you delay your maturity, you push it out from a time period where fusarium is less likely to occur, which is mid-June. That's generally when we see our flowering. But because maturity was delayed, it pushed fusarium, the flowering into the late June, early July, and that's a hot, humid time in Manitoba associated with high-risk plant for fusarium. And here's just some data that shows you that, if you're seeding later, you're generally not going to have a very well-developed plant going into the fall, and it just shows you that you're going to delay your maturity likely, 4 to 10 days. And that can push it into that later June period where it's at more risk for fusarium. The second small tip that makes a difference for a uniform crop is seeding rate. Here's some data from Brian Barris' research out of Lethbridge, where you can see seeding at a higher seeding rate, you have far more uniform crop. And that, again, makes a difference for fungicide timing. It also makes a difference on yield. I'll get to that in a second. But here's what I think would happen with Flourish last year. A lot of guys are used to seeding Falcon in Manitoba, which is a very small seed, shown by your 1,000 kernel weight of about 32 on this slide. So to get a desired 23 plants per square foot, you only need about a bushel and a half of it an acre. And I think when guys switch to Flourish, they still seeded it at a bushel and a half an acre. But Flourish has a lot higher 1,000 kernel weight, and you actually, to get the same plants per square foot number, you have to seed it closer to 2 bushel an acre. And I think that's why we've had thinner stands to start with. The Flourish, which caused it to tiller more, which had a broader window for infection prior to trying your fungicide, and that's why, one of the reasons why it had a very high occurrence of fusarium in the last year. Seed treatment, here's something that can help you have a uniform crop, and I never recommended it up until about 3 or 4 years ago. I'm just starting to see more and more research showing that it benefits the crop to have a seed treatment on winter wheat, which doesn't seem to be normal practice, but it does help with vigor and stand establishment. There is a plant health benefit to some of these products, and that helps when you're seeding into stressful conditions, maybe a little bit later in the fall. Anything you can do to provide a little bit more vigor for that stand will result in a uniform crop. And here's some data Brian Barris put together for Barrett to show the economic return of using a seed treatment versus a control. And you can see the benefit there. And there is a yield benefit. I'm not saying you're going to get that every year, but there are other reasons for using a seed treatment, like the uniform stand, that I think it just pays to use the product every year. And finally, seeding depth. And this is something that seems pretty basic, but you can see from the chart there that the deeper you seed your winter wheat, the more of a yield penalty you get. What I'm seeing in the field is that there's quite a bit of variability in the same field as far as seeding depth. You'll get some plants seeded where you like to be about the 1 inch and a half inch, and you can see the plants on the right are far more developed and a bigger, thicker crown and healthier looking than the ones on the left that we see and more deeply in the soil. And then you're going to start seeing patchy fields. You're going to see more tillering from those plants in the spring. You're going to see a less uniform stand when you have those conditions. If you can seed more of your field at the 1 inch depth, you're going to have more uniform crop. And I think what's happening is the guys are starting to seed a little too fast. I was at a presentation recently where John Deere was able to share some of its data from its customers. They allow them to share certain portions of information like seeding rate, and they're finding their customers are seeding on average at 6.5 miles per hour, which is a little too fast. I suggest using a canola seeding speed around that 5 mile per hour top, because otherwise, if you get going too fast in our falls, especially with dry soils, you get that bounce that causes seed depth issues. The last big tip for managing for fusarium is obviously fungicide application. I think most of you understand, proper timing for this. You want most of your heads on the main stem to be fully emerged, and half of them starting to flower. And you can see that's about where you start seeing the first anthers visible. So as soon as you start seeing those anthers, get out there and spray. And my advice is, if you're unsure, it's always better to be 2 days early versus 2 days late. Here's some research to back up the benefits of the fungicide application. And this isn't just showing benefits because of fusarium. It's hidden your. I always see leaf spotting diseases in the crop, and it's very important to protect that crop at flag. So that shows you the kind of yields you've seen across the prairies using our partner Bear Crop Science product, Follicure and Prairies. You might notice there, though, that you got pretty good control at flag leaf using the 3/4 rate of Follicure, so that's something that I often recommend to our clients. Here's some of our own in-house research that we did in North Battleford with various products at various timing, and you can see the benefits are there from using the fungicide treatment. So it's pretty much a no-brainer for the guys that I work with. The best, most successful growers spray it at flag and at early hitting every year, like clockwork. Now, you can do everything right and still have high levels of fusarium in your grain just because of the year. I had one producer last year that seeded Flourish, and he did everything right. He seeded it heavier, about 2.5 bushel an acre. He used a seed treatment, and his seeding depth was very uniform. He ended up with 3.5% fusarium in his Flourish, which is a lot lower than the provincial averages, but he still had to deal with fusarium. Here's a product that is being tested right now by Siggy that uses a near-infrared transmittant in order to sort and remove fusarium-infested seeds from the seed lot. And it can be used at the industrial grain handling level. So Siggy has all the information on this bowl mill. It's available with a PowerPoint and with a video on their website. So if you want some more information on this, it does show that it makes sense economically for a producer to use this technology. So hopefully, in the future, the producer will be able to go to his grain terminal and they'll be able to provide extra value for that producer by sorting through his fusarium infected grain and removing the fusarium from it. My outlook quickly for fusarium this year, well, we had pretty uniform stands in Manitoba. Most of them went into the fall at the 3-leaf stage, and a lot of producers seeded Emerson, so I don't think that we're going to see much pressure. Certainly not like we did last year with our early spring. I think the question you're going to have to prepare yourself for is manipulator. It's a plant growth regulator that will shorten the straw. A lot of our producers went from seeding short varieties to Emerson, which is 6 inches taller or so, then Falcon and Flourish. So, the straw management is a big issue. So prepare yourself for questions about that product. And right now, I do know that there are 2 grain companies that won't accept grain that was sprayed with manipulators. So hopefully that changed, because it does look like it has some pretty good benefits for the prairies. Okay, on to stripe rust. Just to wrap things up, it looks from the Pacific Northwest models that stripe rust is going to be an issue out there and could cause yield losses up to 60%. So this is the first indication that we had with March 5th that this is something that we should keep an eye out for out in Alberta. And you can see, for those of us lucky enough in Manitoba not to be too familiar with this one, how the rust occurs in stripes across the leaf. There is a big difference between varieties that are resistant to those that are susceptible, as you can clearly see. So if you look at winter wheat, here's the information on stripe rust resistance. You can see the newer varieties. like the Emersons, the Moats, they are moderately resistant, whereas the older varieties like Falcon and Mateo seem to be fairly susceptible. So if you have a producer that has winter wheat, your first question would be to ask him what variety he grew, because if it's a highly susceptible one, you definitely want to be on track to monitor those fields. So if you're out in Alberta, the traditional advice is to start monitoring early spring, especially where you have a variety with poor resistance. Um, it's too late for seed treatment, but keep that in mind that they can be beneficial. And spraying early at that T1 stage is pretty critical if you're starting to see any kind of stripe rust, because it can hammer your yield. And you may need an extra application for it. That's the traditional advice. What I found with disease is that, man, scouting, by the time you start seeing it in your field, and if you get it, by the time you get out there and spray it after seeing it, you've already paid a yield penalty. And that's why most of the guys that I deal with in Manitoba, they just get out and they spray a flag and they spray it early heading. They just do it automatically. If you have some disease concerns, there are those forecasting systems so that if you have a susceptible variety and your forecast system shows that you're at high risk, again, just go out and spray. I don't know if scouting really does what we want it to do. Of course, protecting the flag leaf, everyone knows how important that is. I'll just move past this slide. And here's your application times. Generally, what our friends in Barrie tell us is that for the diseases we manage for in Manitoba, they can grow through anything that occurs early. They just grow through the disease. The key times are at flag and at heading. So if their data shows it's not really economic benefit shown to spraying at the T1 stage, with the exception now, it appears to be stripe rustic. Again, if you have susceptible variety, and most of them are only at best moderately resistant, if it's me and there's stripe rust showing up in my field or in neighbors' fields, I'd be out there and spraying. And that's about all I have. So thank you for listening. If there's any questions, I'll take them now.